Well, they upload like videos to their YouTube of people telling their personal story or whatever. And the most recent one was a guy who was circumcised at 46, and he's on the
Wow.
15 Square talking about, how unhappy he was. He says he made like a huge personal error to go ahead with the operation. So
Did he?
that's an
Was it done for
interesting one.
medical reasons?
I believe so. I can't really imagine why you would have done it otherwise at 46. I haven't listened to the full video. I just read the description, but it'd be interesting to listen to that. It's definitely a contrast.
Yeah.
Something else interesting I thought that we may want to look at in terms of methods, especially what's going on with some of these adult circumcisions now. Have y'all seen this new, they call it's like a circumcision stapler, and it's like a um essentially it's like it looks kind of like a restoration device, but instead of where it would actually stretch the skin, it has a circular cutter and stapler that essentially you just like screw it on and then you press it like you would press a stapler, and it cuts the skin in the circle, and then it also like sutures it with staples at the same time that are the dissolving staples. They've come out with it. It's being used in China right now, I think, and a lot of Asia.
What the? That is strange. Like a DIY fucking.
Well, it's
they
not. Yeah.
it's not DIY. They do sell them. You can buy them on eBay if you want to. If you're really into that. But it says that you don't want to use it unless you have the advice of a doctor or a medical staff,
I
supervisor.
wonder, if
I
like
thought-
kitchen knives should come with the same warnings.
Yeah, I read about that as well. I thought it was like the goal of it was for it to be like an all-in-one device for use in like developing countries, like to reduce
So-
like HIV in like Africa and stuff like that. I
Well,
thought like
there's two of them. So there's the stapler one, and then there's the one that Bill Gates was behind. It's the something ring. It's like I'm gonna call it the Shanghai ring, but I know that's not right. It's the
What do you?
it's the Shanghai.
it sounds pretty
ring.
close.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
What do you reckon the whole like what is it with Bill Gates? Like what is it with like economic elites in the United States and their insistence on spreading the doctrine of circumcision? What does he think he has to gain from this? Like, it just seems really unnecessarily cruel.
Well, it's through his philanthropy. Oh my god, I can't say that word properly. Isn't it? Like,
yeah, but there's really nothing philanthropic about going around and just cutting people's dicks.
I mean, he's done some really good. He's done some really good things, but he has his hands in a lot of different socio-political, medical. I mean, there's the circumcision thing that he's behind. There's, he's throwing a ton of money at all of the COVID vaccinations and all that. And I say, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I really have trouble that Bill Gates, who is not a doctor, apparently knows more about COVID than leading doctors.
I think it's all about the money, isn't it? The more money you have, apparently, the more influence you have.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. Are we recording yet? Are we?
Yeah, let me just introduce the episode, I guess.
Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah, I'm recording. And we're sort of just picking up where we left off last time. Pretty much talking about Wes's experience as well as just circumcision in general and our opinions about it, and developing a discussion around that. And if you guys want to introduce yourselves, you can.
I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Liam, and I'm here to be upset about being circumcised. No, I'm just kidding. But really, I'm excited to continue our conversation from last week. I feel like we were getting somewhere pretty interesting, pretty productive.
I go by Otter. I'm an American man, early 30s, circumcised as an infant, doing foreskin restoration for just over 2 years now with great results, and also an Intactivist for probably about the past year and a half or so. I do an Instagram page, and then I also come on this podcast and share my experiences.
And I'm Wes. I'm from the UK, early 30s as well, and I got circumcised as an adult for health reasons. And in some ways, I think I'm almost here to provide like a different perspective, because I'm actually sort of happy that that was done in comparison to a lot of other people.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. I think last time we were sort of picking your brain about your opinion about circumcising as an infant versus having the choice as a teen or as an adult, pretty much. Yeah.
I think it's quite a delicate and challenging, I guess, opinion to have in some ways, because I probably say that I'm against like routine infant circumcision, but having to get it done for health reasons when I was older makes me kind of think, would I rather had it done as a baby and then not had any of the problems and had to go through all the stuff later? So it gives me sort of a unique perspective, I guess.
I mean, I feel like unique is definitely the right word, in that like the vast majority of people are not going to end up having those same problems that you're having. So if something that radical was done to them at birth and they really never got a choice, or they never got a chance to even experience what the natural human body is like, I think that would be kind of a great tragedy. And that's kind of what we're experiencing here on a massive scale in North America. So just like, there's really no way to make the kind of prediction like, oh, like this person is going to have these rare kind of complications with their penis that it's going to be really uncomfortable, painful, and it's better to do this kind of serious procedure as an infant. And I think that's something that's possible to even say. So don't think how you could really even like conceive of that being within the realm of either something that is ethically acceptable or something that's even medically acceptable. Because if you're using circumcision as preventative medicine, it's kind of a radical measure to prevent pretty rare complications that can just be dealt with down the line, rather than excising all that tissue for no good reason.
One thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is, the context of the we're talking about. So we've got Wes coming from the UK, Liam coming from Canada, Nick and I both in America. And last time we had talked about the statistic coming out of, I believe it was Finland or one of the other Scandinavian countries, where they had said about 1 in 16,000 or so men will need a medical circumcision of some kind within their lifetime. So our odds of that are pretty slim. The other thing I think about is when I think about American doctors and they are justifying routine circumcision of infants, I think they kind of latch on to those 1 in 16 chances, or those very obscure, they'll say, well, this could help prevent penile cancer when you're old. Well, the chances of getting penile cancer are somewhere right around 1% or less. And it's typically thought of as an old men's disease, like in end of life type, a very much geriatric disease. And so I feel like there's this, they kind of bill it as this prophylactic kind of, let's use this as a way to prevent all these potential health concerns. But in reality, when we look at the scientific data, and I keep saying over and over again, I hate if I ramble saying this, I feel like when Intactivists focus on this scientific data, this peer-reviewed data, that we are not just making up opinions, we are basing this off what has been observed over and over again. The reality is that the chances of these different diseases and things, it's not that they can't happen, it's just that they're very rare, and it's hard to justify, like Liam said, excising healthy, normal tissue and putting an infant or a child through that trauma, that documented trauma, to be preventing something that may not even happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you had it done for medical reasons and then you then had a son in the future and hereditary traits follow through the generations and stuff, it kind of makes you consider an alternative as well. Because I agree that prevented using it as a prevented medicine for 100% of people isn't justified. But if you are in a position where it is significantly more likely, then that kind of tips the scales a little bit. Just like there's a history of cancer in my family and I need to have regular tests and stuff because I have a much higher chance of developing it and they want to catch it early and stuff. So I think that gives a different perspective on it. So I guess I would agree with what you said, but then also think that in some ways there might be an alternative viewpoint as well.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, you're saying potentially that these kind of penile complications could be hereditary. Is there any evidence of that? Did your father struggle with this? Also, I mean, even on the off chance, let's say that somehow, you were able to do some kind of long form study on genomes and whatnot, and you discovered that yes, indeed, these kind of complications can be hereditary, and there's about a 50% chance that your son is going to end up with those complications, 50-50. That still doesn't even come close to justifying that kind of radical procedure, even in a preventative sense, right? So first of all, you've got the 50% chance that he's going to grow up and he's going to be fine. And then second of all, even if he lands in that 50% chance where something is wrong, that decision can be made down the road. You still don't actually have a right to take someone's bodily autonomy away from them. Even if you think it's justified, even if you come up with any which way around it to suggest that it is somehow right to do that to an infant, it is just not at the end of the day. I mean, if you're talking about it from a human rights perspective, if you're talking about it from a consent perspective, and especially honestly, if we're talking about it from a medical perspective, it's certainly just not justified. And that idea of it being a 50% chance seems rather generous. It seems to me extremely unlikely that your penile complications will be passed on to your son.
I'm just curious, Wes, because you had the operation as an adult. Can you talk just a little bit about kind of what your recovery was like, kind of your timeline of once you had the circumcision? How long were you out? Did you have to be in the hospital? What was kind of the aftermath of that?
So I guess it does vary from person to person, but they when I went and had it done, the doctor said wait between 6 to 8 weeks before having any sort of sexual activity, and even said that you may want to wear a condom for 6 months or something, because you might want to like reduce friction and stuff like that, and before you kind of get used to the difference and stuff, because there's a lot of talk about, you know, it being like really super sensitive like afterwards and stuff. So it was for me, it was about, I don't know, about, I think I felt fairly recovered at the 4-week mark, but it was it was a stressful thing to go through, and there was a lot of like moments where you kind of think, oh shit, is that like, I don't know if we're allowed to swear, actually, I should have asked. But you kind of think like, you know, is this going right? Like, is this how it's supposed to look? Like, you know, it does it feel worse today? Should I like call the doctor and stuff? So there was a lot of, during that like 4-week sort of recovery period. Well, actually, it was mostly kind of the first 2-3 weeks, that you're really stressed. You kind of don't really want to go out because you're worried that, you know, something might happen, like a stitch might like break and you'll just start bleeding whilst you're in the queue at the supermarket or something crazy. So it's the
Did you,
recovery isn't, sorry.
did you have the dissolvable stitches, or did you have to go in and actually get stitches removed?
So I had the dissolvable stitches, but apparently my body's not good at breaking down dissolvable stitches, so I had to go back and get the stitches removed.
Oh, jeez, that sounds.
I was like really worried. Like it got to something like, because you kind of like, I read online that at the 2-week mark the stitches like need to be removed, otherwise you're left with like additional scarring, which you don't get like if you had it done as a baby. Like some people that have it done as a baby, like there's no scarring at all, but like as an adult you have to like, you're thinking about like the appearance of it a lot more, and you get a bit more paranoid about, you know, wanting to minimize like scarring and stuff. So like when it got to like the 2-week mark, like my doctor was really good. Like I literally just like text him like the day before, because he gave me his like contact details, and I was just like, none of the stitches have dissolved, what do I do? And he just said, I'll come in tomorrow and then we'll just remove them. And it was like, it was actually okay doing it, which was good. Like I was worried it's going to be like painful, and it's not like it wasn't painful. It was like, you know, like little pinches, which isn't, you know, ideal, but it went fairly straightforward in the end. And I think, and the sense of relief at that point was like immense, because you don't have like this foreign thing in your body anymore. It's kind of like your body just gets to heal and stuff, and that
Right.
massively boosted my like self-confidence as well, at that point, because it kind of, and like the doctor was very reassuring and was kind of like, and I was like, oh, this bit doesn't look quite right, and he's like, oh, it's fine, your body will heal, you need to give it just a bit more time and stuff. And like in time it did, and it was fine. But you always go through this like paranoid, stressful thing, and then you kind of feel like you can't talk to anybody about it because it's such an like intimate thing, which means you kind of like compound all of the stress just on yourself. So even though like before I wasn't necessarily advocating that like if I had a son I would get him done, but in my head all the stuff that I went through both during the operation, the recovery, and the problems beforehand has a weight on me as well. Like I'm not saying that weight is stronger than the other counter arguments, but it's still something that makes me consider it, I guess. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and you know, a couple things that I thought of as you were saying that. Thank you for sharing that. One of them was this idea that I think if someone, you know, hearing your experience, if someone is a teenager, a young adult, an adult who decides to go through this, I think they really have to, you know, it's not something that people I think often are just like, oh, I'll go get circumcised today. I mean, see, it seems like they really do have to put a lot of thought into it, and to know that it is this as an adult or as a teen, it's a much different recovery process than it is as an infant. That was one thing. The other thing was I thought of just hearing some Intactivists speak, and I don't remember where this came from, but it was an idea talking about routine circumcision in America, and it was basically saying the reason that doctors circumcise children as infants in America is because no one would want to as an adult. No one, it's very rare that someone would say, oh, I want to get a scalpel and cut off my foreskin as a teen or an adult. I've heard so many stories of teens that are now adults whose parents wanted them to get circumcised, somewhere around the age of like 13, 14, 15. And many of them say, they kind of got around it one way or another, or said, my parents just had to ask me once, and they realized that I was not going to have a knife anywhere near me. And so I think it definitely speaks, hearing your experience as an adult. I think that the people who choose to have this done as a teenager or an adult, they really do want to have it done. And I think that there is validity and there is weight behind a consenting young adult or adult who wants to go through that process.
Yeah.
I think that they should be fully informed, but I think that they have the right, if they choose their own body, to do that.
I think to add to that though, I think a lot of this comes down to like circumcision is very taboo, and therefore like the problems that I suffered with for years, and I would have much rather have got it sorted sooner, like potentially at birth, but at least younger than I was when I had it done. And I think a lot of that sort of negativity comes from, and we can almost lead on to a different topic, like the Intactivist movement, where you're almost kind of scared, like you've got a problem, you're almost scared to go to the doctor because you just hear about all these people complaining about being mutilated and you're suffering, you want something fixed, and you're too scared because of what if that fix is worse than what you've got now. And I think in a lot of situations that plays on your mind. And I have spoken to other people that had it done as an adult, and everyone says it's better after, but then again, there's been different motivations for the reasons, so they often had problems before. But I think like one thing stopped me from going to the doctors much sooner because of like fear of from what you hear from the internet.
Well, and I think that taboo, we see that in America too. And you guys, y'all can tell me if you agree, like America and Canada. I think first off, we're so hesitant to speak about circumcision that nobody even asks doctors questions about it. It's just like a child is born and it's like, well, doctors say, do you want to get him circumcised? And they're like, well, that's what my family did, or that's what my parents did, or whatever. But also it's so taboo that, teens and young adults don't even feel empowered to ask about it. Like, to me, I think one of the most awkward moments that I would dread would be going to my parents and saying, why did you decide to circumcise me? Because to me, I don't know why. It seems like it should be a normal conversation, but it just feels so taboo, because I don't want to be discussing that part of my body with my parents. I think maybe part of it is I'm afraid of the answer that I would get, which would probably be something like, well, it was the 80s and that's what everybody was doing. But I'm also afraid, to hear something like, well, your mother's side of the family is all intact, or your father's side of the family is all intact, but we decided to do something different and get you cut. I mean, it's those kind of conversations that are so taboo, and we're getting to the point where even there are teenagers and young adults in the United States and probably Canada too, who don't even realize that they were circumcised. And I think we said this last week. They look at how they look and they think, oh, this is how everybody looks, because that's how the textbooks look. That's how, it's changing now. Thank goodness. Now the rate is finally starting to decline. But yeah,
I agree. I think those are rubbish reasons to circumcise, but I think I can also offer a contrast there, because if like I'd had like a proper discussion with my dad or something earlier, or had proper like medical exams, then maybe my problem would have been discovered when I was younger, and then I would have had it fixed sooner and not had to suffer through the issues as well. So I think there's a lot of talk about that on both sides, like making sure like somebody is healthy, but then also making sure that if they are circumcised, they don't necessarily have the negative body image that's associated with it as well, through actually being talked about, and it not being this thing that happened to me that like was just to make me look like dad, which has this negative connotation.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a context dependent thing, especially, I mean, in North America, because we have the massive rates of routine infant circumcision. It's kind of like a different scenario. So when we're talking about it, it's not really like in our purview to be really worried about the 1 to however many men are out there listening who were circumcised for medical reasons or whatever. And that's like a really, really, really small minority in this situation. And then especially as well, when we're talking about doing this to infants, it ultimately comes down to, this is a consent issue and this is a human rights issue. So even if you're saying, hey, here's another perspective on why I might have wanted this to be done to me as an infant, you can only know that after the fact, right? There's no way to possibly know that at the time. So you don't know how potentially unhappy you might have been if this was done to you as an infant, and then you'd felt robbed of your natural body and everyone around you was different from you. So you don't know how terrible that might have been compared to the suffering that you have gone through and have experienced. I think especially all three of us here know how absolutely torturous it is to have this done to you, against your will.
Do you think?
Curious. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that? I mean, I agree with what you're saying. Do you think there is a difference between the religious aspects of it in comparison there to it being routine as well, though? Just because somebody might be religious and therefore hold it in a very different light as well.
No, my answer is no, and I'll explain. First off, so the majority of people are like, I'll start with the context that I know and I'm familiar with, and that's Jews, and I'm Jewish, and that was the reason I was circumcised. Alder talked about, how terrible the idea of like going to your parents would be or whatever. And I was just thinking, I actually have gone to my parents. I have talked about it before, and I've heard the reasons, and mainly this kind of vague sense of tradition, right? Neither of my parents believe in God or Judaism really. They don't really follow any of kind of the legalistic prescriptions of the Torah, except for this one, and this one somehow sticks out from the rest, and that's because it's so deeply culturally entrenched. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that men who have it done to them are perpetuating it onto their children. And so when I hear you try to come up with reasons or justifications for potentially doing this to your child, if you were to have a child, it kind of makes me makes my skin crawl just a little bit, because I'm like, this is not the direction we're moving. I know that you don't want to be made to feel bad about the choice you made and your body, and I totally understand that, and I totally think that's valid. But there's no jumping off point from there where you can make some kind of justification. And to go back to the original point, which is about religious issues, I really don't think it matters in what regard people who are very serious about their religion feel about circumcision, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or whatever, because we wouldn't afford those people the same kind of religious freedom and the same kind of, rights of the parents over the right of the child if they wanted to do this to their daughter. We all know and recognize that would be completely abhorrent and horrible. So there's no reason we should be treating boys any differently.
So I'm curious, Nick, because you've had the chance to go to some protests and kind of encounter everyday people on the street. What are some of the responses that you've seen from people? I'm just curious, like what things have you heard, just kind of from the normal person on the street?
It's really interesting, honestly. You get a lot of people that are shocked and they don't really know what to say at first. They look over to like whoever they're with and they're like, what do you think about this? Or you get intact people that are like, oh, nice. And they're usually, some of them are like, why is this a huge issue? They're sort of like confused. And those are the ones that are usually not from North America. And then there's others that are like, okay, yeah, I'm on board. But they don't tend to, like pick up a sign or whatever.
Sorry, I was going to ask you a question. Like, do you ever get people that approach you that are Jewish and say the Intactivist movement is kind of insulting to their religion? Because I know in some European countries they did talk about banning circumcision, and then there was a whole anti-Semitism wave because people saying that would destroy their religious freedom and stuff. And I think all the proposed bans were all stopped because it was seen as being anti-Jewish. Has anyone approached you from a religious perspective and said anything like that?
Not really, which is kind of surprising. They usually, people that are against it just are like, fuck you and walk away. They don't engage with me usually on like a debate or something like that, based on like their reasons for why they think their religious right to circumcise should be protected under law. Usually that doesn't happen.
I like to kind of break down the kind of idea that opposing circumcision is anti-Semitic or anything along those lines, because to me it really points at this fundamental oddity that has to do with kind of Jewish identity, right? And so when we say, hey, like, what makes me Jewish? What is it about me as a person that makes me Jewish, whether I like it or not? Is it because of my genetics? Is it my blood? Is it my my family, my descendants, or is it that I'm circumcised and that's the deal breaker, right? Or at the end of the day, what is it? And so when people say, banning circumcision or opposing circumcision is like cultural erasure, anti-Semitic, it's destroying our religion, is it really that important to your religion or identity that you practice this kind of genital cutting, right? Would we give the same kind of degree of freedom if they were doing the same things to their daughters, right? So why do we consider that parents should have this right over their sons but not their daughters? We're not treating people equally in that regard. And then, even more, I really don't think it's necessary at all, because for the vast majority of Jews, they're not necessarily going to be like Orthodox or super conservative in their religious beliefs. And so they're unlikely to be following most of the laws of the Torah. So why, if you're unlikely to be potentially even like believing in God, let alone following any of the laws of the Torah, are you going to follow its most extreme law and impose that upon your son, who, first of all, not only has his own right to bodily autonomy, but has his own right to religious freedom, right? What about my religious freedom? So it's kind of, the whole thing is really backwards and self-contradictory and obviously stupid. And I think a lot of times Jewish groups and Jewish lobbies use anti-Semitism to shut things down. It's very easy to throw accusations of anti-Semitism to get something shut down. And I know that because I'm Jewish and I've seen it. I've seen it all the time. And I think this kind of overreactive nature of the Jewish community as well is really common. You see that with anti-Zionism as well. Saying, I mean, in the UK, for instance, like the way they what they did to my boy, what they did to Jeremy Corbyn, like the guy is obviously not anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I know,
Like
that's terrible.
being pro-Palestinian does not make you anti-Semitic. So you can see that a lot of the Jewish people who are in power, who have a lot to say in the media and a lot of influence in that regard, tend to be right-wing, and so are not interested in, let's say, Palestinian rights, but among other things, individual rights, the rights of the child to bodily autonomy.
It's interesting perspective, because like my ex was Jewish, and I've got Jewish friends as well who I have had a bit of a debate about circumcision with. This was before I had it done. So it was on my mind because I was thinking about it, and it was very interesting speaking to them about it as well. And I'd be interested to hear Liam and Nick's, as Jewish guys, or culture or heritage, your perspective on this as well. Because when I was chatting to my ex, he never really he made a distinction between being religiously Jewish and being culturally Jewish. And he said that for him, he was culturally Jewish, and that the being circumcised was more kind of like a badge of honor, like being proud at his heritage and wanting to maintain his heritage. And he talked about, stamping out, like during the Holocaust in Germany, of like a huge number of Jews, which is horrific. And for him, it's about preserving what he feels is kind of Jewish culture and part of him, and that was very important to him. And we did like briefly discuss, like, would we adopt in the future or have surrogates and stuff, and he was very adamant that he wanted them to be culturally Jewish and to be circumcised, because he felt that that was really important for him to maintain his culture. And I hear what you're saying about that, but for him it was very much kind of like wearing the Star of David or something like that. Like, he wanted to, it was very important to him. And we didn't discuss it any more than that, because it was a very emotive subject. We thought about Christmas trees quite a bit.
Well,
but
I mean, I'm sure, and that makes a lot of sense, because it sounds like, from my perspective, that he is coming up with here a way to rationalize and justify the reality that he's been, the kind of cards that he's been handed. So he's had this done to him for cultural, religious reasons to do with Judaism, and he has decided himself that he feels that it's like a badge of honor, and that it's like the Star of David, and that it honors Jewish cultural history. And that is something that he's decided for himself. So I'm not going to say that is an invalid way to look at circumcision, but unlike that view, which he has decided for himself, he was not able to decide for himself what happened to his body. And I think it's actually pretty unlikely that he would have made that choice for himself just because he wanted to honor cultural Judaism. I don't think he would have gone out of his way to have that done to himself. So I think there's on the one hand,
I was just going to say, like, I think if knowing, like, he was culturally very proud and worked with like Jewish charities and stuff like that. So I think, if anything, if he hadn't have been done and his parents had made the decision for him to decide when he was older, I actually think he would have done it, because for him, it's something that connects him to his heritage, and he sees that as being very important, and he sees that the movement against that is almost trying to eradicate that aspect of it. And I don't really want to draw comparisons to like the Holocaust and stuff, but he was that passionate, let's say, about it.
Well,
So
again,
one thing
I want to emphasize. I'll let you speak, Others. Sorry.
So one thing that jumped out to me is talking about this importance of the cultural heritage. And now we have whole groups of Jews in the Reform movement who don't require circumcision. It's an option, but there's also Brit Shalom, which is the naming ceremony, which can take the place of the Brit Milah. And one of the things that I jumped out to me as you were talking, Wes, was this idea of, what if Jewish fathers explain to their sons, maybe around the time that they get their bar mitzvah, this is a cultural mark that has been important to me. This is the significance of it, but you have a choice. It's your body, and we're going to let you make that decision for yourself, as opposed to deciding it for you. And what if they could do that in a way that really gave the young man autonomy, not just like, this is a decision that's up to you, but our family's going to shun you for the rest of your existence if you don't choose to get circumcised. But really said, here's the history behind it, here's the meaning behind it, here's what I think about it. You take time, study the Torah, think about where you are spiritually, and you decide if you want to do this or not. I think of it in some ways, growing up Christian, we had confirmation, which is some parallels between that and bar and bat mitzvahs. It's the time in the Christian background where you make an active commitment to be a Christian and to the church. And it's kind of this, at least in my background, it's an expectation, just like you're baptized, you will be confirmed. And confirmation is not optional. It's not if you want to be confirmed, it's when you are confirmed. But I feel like, if we circumcision to much more of a choice, just like I feel like we should shift confirmation to a choice. I mean, I think it's ridiculous to buy into and pledge to any religion that you don't feel meets your ideals. And I think that, as being someone who is, 13, 14, 15, you have a brain, and you're able to think, and you're able to process information and make that decision. And I think that we need to give more autonomy if we're going to keep this around as a religious right, or even as a cultural right. We need to give children or young adults the option to partake in it or not partake in it, and for that to be a valid thing, not something that we ridicule them about one way or another.
I think I would agree with that, and I think that trying to focus on the body positivity side, no matter what side of the equation you're on, when they're at a sufficient age to make a decision, then I think that is like completely valid. I think one of the challenges is that with the Intactivist movement it kind of implies that if you're not intact, you're like not good, you're mutilated. And I think that's kind of the challenge, because if I did have a son, for example, or if we assume I was with my ex still, and culturally it was important for them to be Jewish, and we did say wait until they were 10, 11 and gave them a decision, gave them a choice rather, then I think it would have a very different impact if they felt that they weren't making a wrong decision either way. It was their decision, and they could either choose to go down that path or not to, assuming that they're fully informed. And I'm not saying there's any bias in that, but I'd be interested to hear what Nick thinks with his Judaism and how that's impacted with his family as well. Like, has that created any rifts with the Intactivist movement and your family at all?
Well, I would just like to say that it's important to think about this religious reason for circumcision, because it's like quite prevalent, and it's being debated in Scandinavian countries and stuff like that. There's money being put behind it, and I think it's important to note that, you know, holding on to these religious texts, I don't personally like totally abide by all the laws of the Torah, or all the commandments that it asks of me, or all the sacrifices that comes along with the commitment of that sort of thing. But I do consider myself like culturally Jewish, and I've discussed with my family about the reasons why I've been circumcised, and it's sort of been like a mixture of like, like tradition, and like your dad did it, or my mom was like, oh, it's just like how it is, like isn't that how it's supposed to be, she said to me. I yeah I don't think
So
it's created any rifts actually, which is nice.
what do you think though? Because the justifications kind of you gave there seem to be more kind of what the typical American routine circumcision is, rather than it being as much focused on the Jewish cultural side. Like in comparison to my ex, who was Jewish,
Right.
who saw it as being very important for him to demonstrate his heritage. Like, do you think that wasn't the case with you?
I don't believe that's sort of like a thing that I have to show to be a proud Jewish person. I don't think that's what I think Judaism is about. I think it's about learning something from reading the Torah and applying it to your life, but not necessarily taking it literally.
Yeah, I mean,
So would you?
imagine your takeaway from reading the biblical text is not anything like spiritually, deep or rich, but rather that you have to cut your son's penis to go along with this kind of Bronze Age rite. Not to mention, of course, that modern circumcision is severely worse than the circumcision that was being practiced by the ancient Israelites. But I do want to just make myself clear when it comes to the religious situation that no matter what, no matter how someone feels about it post facto, post having had it done to them, right? So Wes, when you're talking about your ex, this is someone who already had it done to them. So they don't have a choice but to cope with it somehow. So whether or not they decide that that's an important religious expression for them isn't really important to the question of whether or not it should have been done to them as an infant, right? When I think about any infant at all in the world, if anything like this is being done to them, male, female, if their genitals are being cut in any way, shape, or form, if their toenails are being cut off for whatever reason, anything of the sort, any kind of body modification or mutilation, all I can think of is this is just going against their human rights. It doesn't matter. The reason doesn't matter. There's no reason, right?
So yeah. So Liam and Nick then, as Jewish men, would you say that you would align yourself with like I can't remember what they're called, like Orthodox and liberal and stuff? Like what are they, like sections of Judaism or
I
something?
assume we would both say reform, or about
Okay,
as reform as you can be.
So, and is that the one that doesn't require circumcision then? And my question was, would you align yourselves to that then? And any family that you bring up, would you raise them in that perspective? Or do you think
Well,
almost the circumcision aspect has alienated yourself a bit from Judaism?
really, really good question, actually, and I appreciate that you asked. To me, my answer is complicated. So for me, circumcision has absolutely alienated me from Judaism. There's no world in which I can believe or care about the Jewish God who mutilated me. I have no affections for him, and I have no affections for the religion which surrounds the practice. And it isn't to say that I'm not interested in it. It isn't to say that I haven't read a lot of the Hebrew Bible and that I'm not interested in learning about Judaism. And that isn't to say that I won't raise my kids to be Jewish, because since I won't circumcise them if I have children, I will comfortably raise them Jewish with all the Jewish holidays and all the things that I love and like about being raised Jewish, and they won't be alienated from the religion. They can experience and enjoy the religion without having to be, having had this choice made for them to be so automatically, quote unquote, involved in it, right? I don't think it's really necessary for someone to be Jewish to be circumcised. I think it's ridiculous. Either being Jewish is something religious, it's something cultural, it's something ethnic. The Jewish people got to make a choice. And at the end of the day, I don't care what that choice is, as long as that choice isn't being Jewish means being circumcised. I believe you can be Jewish and have your whole body, and that is a perfectly good solution to this whole issue. Nobody needs this done to them against their will. If they want to go out and do it when they're older, all the fucking power to them. We're talking about infants, talking about defenseless infants who cannot consent.
So one thing that comes to mind is this idea of kind of, we're saying, how has this been continued over generation to generation to generation? And I feel like as much as we have the Reform movement, Jews who are very much saying, circumcision is not a thing, we also have the very Orthodox traditional who are saying it is the covenant. It is the covenant with God and Abraham, and it must be continued as a part of that tradition. And I think a lot of the fear that comes into, labeling Intactivists as anti-Semitism and all of that comes from this idea of, well, what if, said person becomes an Intactivist Jew and decides not to have their son circumcised? Well, then most likely that son is not going to have his son circumcised, and on and on and on. And this is how circumcision ends. And I think, in a good way, this is our generation, I think, is going to be the generation that ends circumcision, because, it's been shown that either being circumcised or being intact is very much passed on to father and son. Well, I'm intact, so I'm keeping my sons intact, or I'm cut, so I'm making sure my sons are cut. I think that the Jewish authority, especially in the kind of Orthodox side of things, has this fear of, what they see as very valuable as the covenant ending, because people are waking up. Jews, not just Reform Jews that are moderate in the middle, are starting to kind of question this and starting to say, just like a lot of Christians are now with the Bible, we're looking at a text that is over 2,000 years old and that has been translated, hundreds of times and has been translated by people. And people are not perfect. I mean, we know, religion tells us that there is divine influence in those texts, and fundamental Jews and fundamental Christians will both say that the text is perfectly accurate in its form, and there is no error in it whatsoever. But in reality, I think we have to revisit these texts, and we have to look at them in terms of the modern world, because when we're looking, especially take the Torah for instance, some of the rules in Leviticus, like you can't eat seafood. Well, there's a whole restaurant industry that's going to be down the crapper with that one. And things like, you can't wear a shirt made of two fabrics. I'm wearing a sweatshirt today that's a cotton poly blend. Technically, I am breaking that law of Torah. I'm not Jewish, so I'm not as concerned about it. But it's this idea. I think they are very afraid that circumcision will die out. And for the more Orthodox Jews who do take it very much as a badge of honor or as a part of their identity, I think part of the reason they do this to very young children is to ensure that that's going to live on. And so, because it's like, well, if you give them a choice, what if they choose no?
Yeah, I totally agree. And to answer Wes's question, personally, I think I would raise my children. I think I have an obligation to not just raise my children with one, certain religion or certain um, set of dogma or set of way of thinking. I think I have an obligation to teach my children that there are, a set of religious texts, and that um, I personally am culturally Jewish, and that's how I identify myself because it's affected me, and I've been to temple and things like that, family events. Um, I think it's important to just keep the door open for your kids because they are human and they have thoughts, and um, they can develop those as they age and mature and start to think for themselves, really.
Do you
Yeah, I
think?
really, really like that. Actually, just quickly, I wanted to clarify that when I said I'd raise my kids Jewish, I didn't mean to put the whole like framework and ideology upon them. More just that with the holidays and family events and stuff like that, just to be included in those, and then obviously present to them the reality of the situation, which is that there are tons of religions, there are tons of things that you can choose to look into and choose to believe in or choose not to, and give them that freedom and that and treat them like human beings. I really like the way you put it, Nick.
Kind of like eclectic religion. Pick and choose the parts that work the best.
Yeah, I was gonna say the modernization of religions is important for them to survive, really, because things like gay marriage, same-sex relationships, having female bishops and things like that were unthinkable not that long ago in a lot of Christianity. And the only way religion does survive is for it to move with the times. I was going to ask Nick, with your family and with your views, if you had like a brother and sister who were raising a son, do you think as an intactivist you would invest a lot of energy into trying to convince them not to circumcise?
I think I would mention it or have a conversation about it, depending on if I was close to my sibling or not. I think it's sort of important to be open about that sort of thing, especially with your family, because it's like it's really something that I don't want to see continue, because it has caused me pain and trauma throughout my life. And um, I wouldn't invest my entire life or all my energy. Like I wouldn't, risk my whole relationship with this person if they decide to go through with the circumcision. Like it's happened to me. I mean, it's happened to many people in America. I mean, it's sad to say, but yeah.
I think part of the hope, at least I can't speak to this as much because I don't have any siblings, but I think if I had siblings, part of my hope would be that just as an Intactivist would take some time to speak to them, that they, even if they didn't agree with it, being your sibling, would take the time to listen and to consider it. And I think one of the issues we run into, especially in the United States, is this is such a hot topic and can be so controversial that we do see a lot of family relationships that are dissolved because of this. We see spouses that are getting divorced over, one of them wants their son cut, the other one doesn't. We see, brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles who stop talking to each other because either there was a decision to not circumcise, there was a decision to circumcise. And we also see people who are, I think that being passionate is very important, but I also feel like there comes a time where there's this line between passionate and crazy. And I think that, a lot of times the Intactivist movement as a whole kind of straddles that line, especially some of the extremists who are so outspoken and use these very triggering visuals and accounts and things. And I think, when we look at terms of how the movement is going to persist and what's going to happen with it, we're going to have to continue to take this kind of a healthy dialogue and not do as much of the, I mean, I think there's some room for, the bloodstained men and the kind of, capturing people's attention. But I think to be taken seriously, there's going to have to be more room for the dialogue that we're having here, as opposed to just kind of, there are times where I think of it as like the little child mentality of like getting in people's faces and saying circumcision is bad, you're evil, you're bad. I think that really can shut people down really quickly, and we have to be careful with that, because in reality, if we keep doing that and don't allow the time for real dialogue to happen, that's how people say, oh, they're crazy Intactivists. Those are the people that are, nuts, and they don't think circumcision is right. They're crazy. I think that's how Intactivists get labeled that way.
I think that goes very well into the link that Liam sent earlier about the article about Intactivism as well, because I see that perspective that you said, like the whole Intactivist movement, even just by name, almost implies that somebody who had to get it done for medical reasons is somehow mutilated, whereas it's almost, you kind of want to focus on the body positivity aspect, and like penis activism, like it could be clarified that it's whole penis, all that sort of stuff, but it's more about the movement where if you have to get it done, then you're just as good as somebody that has or something hasn't, rather. Just like the body positivity movement, where there's a lot of like fat shaming and stuff like that on TV. It's not very good to portray a movement in a negative light, because people just turn off and people just take more of an extreme view of it, like as you mentioned.
Yeah, I noticed that too in that reading. We all of us read a little dissertation about the whole Intactivist movement. Someone was doing a PhD and was writing about the whole movement, and it was very interesting. And I think it sort of captured the whole graphic imagery pretty well. People are really shocked by that, and it definitely shuts people down, like we've mentioned before. Um, I think we can definitely expand on this for the next episode, because I have to go in a bit. But yeah, it's a great thing that we have to consider as a whole movement to sort of, you know, consider if we need this like uh, sort of, I don't know,
Because the key thing
shocking
there
imagery.
is, yeah, because the key thing there is you might get circumcised people that are happy being circumcised, supporting the cause of not routinely circumcising for a bad reason, and you immediately then get a significant amount more people supporting that movement versus people that beforehand would have been completely turned off by that idea.
Yeah, yeah. I think on a tactical level, absolutely, this is all true. For me, unfortunately, though, like the distinction still exists in my head, and I believe this to be true, is that this is mutilation, and it's just as bad as all the shocking imagery and material suggests. And I understand that
No,
none of that stuff is particularly useful for convincing people. So
yeah,
absolutely, I'm on board with that from a rhetorical standpoint.
because
Um,
it's like little things that it builds on. Like, for example, there was a weatherman in the UK who lost half of his arm. Actually, I think it was a woman, and was presenting the weather. And there was a huge amount of people saying really negative things about her online. But the whole point was to say that some people have lost an arm and they're still people. They're still like being able to do things, they can't help it, and portraying more of that in a positive light gains more acceptance, makes things less taboo, and in some ways can change people's perspective and thinking over to a different cause than a lot of what was said on Twitter, that that was frightening for my 8-year-old child to see someone without an arm on TV. But actually, it's more about, no, that's body positivity, because you're introducing your child to somebody who's different, and then in the future they won't be scared if they see somebody that isn't like you in the future.
yeah, no, definitely. I just think, like, for instance, the woman with one arm or whatnot, or anything like this, any other example, nothing is accurate or analogous, because that woman was not strapped down to a table as an infant and had her arm cut off. I assume she lost it in some kind of accident, potentially to some kind of disease. So these kind of comparisons are not really applicable. The only applicable comparison is other forms of genital mutilation, things that are done to women, etc. Right? And I was reading the paper that I linked, in the conclusion, it mentioned something really interesting. It says one study from the World Health Organization suggested that circumcised women were less likely than intact women to contract HIV. So it says then, why then is the World Health Organization not considering a female circumcision policy when they use the same quote unquote justifications to argue in favor of a male circumcision policy? So I think at the end of the day, for people who feel like they have been mutilated and that's their reality, it is important to get the message across that that is what they feel like, and that is what they feel has happened to them, and that is the reality for them, because only through getting that message across can you kind of snap people out of it and awaken them to the reality that is we can't keep doing this. You know, this isn't just a, oh, could I, you know, hey, maybe don't do this. Hey, like, I think this is wrong. That's just my perspective, though. You know, it's really up to you. Like, no, this isn't up to you. This is wrong. People have human rights, right? You can't do this. So I feel really strongly about it, and it's really difficult for me to kind of tone myself down, even though I know that it's necessary for rhetorical purposes. Because for me, it's like when someone tries to justify circumcision to me, they're telling me to my face that I don't deserve human rights. They're telling me to my face that this happened to me and that is okay. And nothing could be farther from the truth. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me.
I feel like we could, I always say this, I feel like we could debate this for hours. Guys, I have to run as well. But thank you for the dialogue, and thank you for the chance to catch up again. And I'm excited to see where we go in future episodes.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining me again. I look forward to the next episode. We can definitely expand on this some more.
Great.
All right, everybody have a wonderful Sunday.
Yeah. Thanks,
Yes,
everyone.
too.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.